Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TÜYİD webinar on ISSB Standards. I am Selin Sanver Nasuhoğlu, and I am the Secretary General of TÜYİD. I'm delighted to have you all here today, and I'm particularly excited to introduce our speaker, Neil Stewart, Director of Corporate Outreach at the IFRS Foundation. Neil has over 20 years of experience in the financial services industry, and he's a leading expert on sustainability disclosure. As the economic and investment decisions are increasingly incorporating sustainability information, IFRS Foundation created ISSB in 2021 as a sister board to the International Accounting Standards Board. ISSB is responsible for developing IFRS sustainability disclosure standards to provide a truly global baseline of sustainability disclosures to further inform economic and investment decisions. Just a brief introduction for some of you who may not be familiar. The ISSB's first two standards, IFRS S1 and IFRS S2, were issued in June 2023, and they are expected to come into effect in 2024. In his presentation today, Neil will discuss the benefits for both companies and investors of a global baseline of sustainability information for the capital markets. Neil's presentation will take about 20 to 25 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session at the end. You can either ask your questions yourself or write them in the chat, and I will read them aloud for you. PDF version of Neil's presentation will be sent to all participants after the webinar. Before I hand over to Neil, I would also like to remind everyone that the TÜYİD IR Summit will be held on December 12th this year, and at the summit, we will be hosting Simon Messenger from the market engagement side of IFRS to further discuss the evolving sustainability standards in the panel. Now, please join me to welcome Neil Stewart to our webinar.
Thank you very much, Celine. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to TÜYID for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a real pleasure to talk about the ISSB. As Celine mentioned, I'll give a quick overview and then be pleased to take questions and hear feedback and continue the discussion. Particularly, I'm interested to learn myself about insights into Turkey's own evolution towards sustainability reporting. So as Celine mentioned, the ISSB has been established under the IFRS Foundation as a sister board to the IASB. I want to draw your attention especially to that third level of governance, the public oversight or public monitoring board of the IFRS Foundation. That's made up of securities regulators. It's chaired by IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, and the other members include key securities regulators. So you can really see that the IFRS Foundation, in setting up the ISSB, has had the full backing and oversight of securities regulators around the world. Indeed, the ISSB was established in response to strong market demand. We all know that investors need decision useful information, but they're not getting it. Despite all the work that's been done by companies and by investors, and for companies, an overwhelming what we call alphabet soup of standards and frameworks that's created cost and complexity, investors are still not getting the information, the consistent, comparable, verifiable information that they need. So it was in response to this landscape that the G20, the G7, IOSCO, and the Financial Stability Board all supported the creation of the ISSB to create a global standard for sustainability reporting for the financial markets. So we're really focused, and it's very relevant to this investor relations audience. It's very relevant because we're very focused on this investor company dialogue. We need to get decision useful information to investors, but this has to be cost effective and efficient for companies. It has to be practical for companies. It has to reduce this burden of the alphabet soup, not increase it. There have been a few key events and milestones just over the last several weeks, over the last 12 weeks or so. We issued the standards at the end of June. I'll explain those standards in a moment. The Financial Stability Board, that's the G20 group that set up the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, announced the handover to the ISSB. IOSCO announced its endorsement of the ISSB standards following its review, recommending that its jurisdictions around the world, representing 95% of the world's capital markets, recommending that they consider incorporating the ISSB standards into their frameworks. And at the end of July, the European Commission, in issuing its final CSRD rules for corporate disclosure of sustainability information, along with us, we announced a very high degree of alignment in our climate-related disclosures. First of all, just a word about the TCFD, because this is really important. The TCFD has been widely taken up around the world by companies, by investors, by financial institutions to look at the financial impact of climate risk, of climate change. It has been a real almost revolution in climate reporting since the TCFD was created in 2016. What the FSB announced was that the ISSB standards mark the culmination of the TCFD's work. They noted that IFRS S1 and S2, our first two standards, really incorporate the TCFD recommendations fully. And the FSB announced that they were transferring the monitoring responsibilities to ISSB as of 2024. So this really signals that we're clarifying, simplifying the so-called alphabet soup. At the same time as the announcement came from the FSB, we released a comparison of the TCFD recommendations with the ISSB standards. And it really shows that if a company is doing ISSB reporting, it does not need also to do a TCFD report. So what we're creating here is what we call a baseline for the financial markets, a baseline of high quality sustainability disclosures, but a baseline that is flexible to work with local jurisdictions as they may require additional disclosures to meet policy needs or to meet the needs of other stakeholders. And companies may also themselves add building blocks, for example, using the GRI standards to meet the needs of other stakeholders beyond investors. A good example of this is in Europe, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but in the European Union, they have what's called an approach to meet their policy and environmental goals and have additional requirements beyond what's needed by investors. We're really very focused on this baseline and what we call interoperability. So that means working with different jurisdictions to ensure that our standards are compatible with local requirements. We have a jurisdictional working group consisting of really the world's biggest capital markets. That's the US, the UK, Europe, China, and Japan, with the oversight or with IOSCO as observers, meeting every month to try to reduce the duplication, reduce the burden as we begin to see mandatory reporting around the world. Building in the TCFD structure is also a good move towards interoperability, considering so many jurisdictions around the world had already been moving toward TCFD reporting. Excuse me, my dog is barking. Sorry about this. Another way that we're moving towards interoperability is with the CDP, also widely used by companies and investors around the world to look at climate disclosure, the formerly known as Carbon Disclosure Project. Starting in 2024, the CDP will be fully incorporating our climate standard into their questionnaire. And we are working closely with the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is also widely used for sustainability reporting, to make sure that the standards are compatible and to try to reduce duplication in reporting. A word about Europe. As I said, we've achieved a very high degree of alignment. And for any large companies that have business in Europe that may be subject to the CSRD, we're working to make sure that if they're doing both the European reporting and the ISSB, that they won't have additional work to do, that we reduce the burden of duplicative reporting. We have really used what is the best of what's already in use in the market. We have not, as we say, reinvented the wheel. We have tried to make this an evolution, not a complete new change for companies. And in part, this was done by consolidating some of the key standards and frameworks into the IFRS Foundation. So I came from SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We combined with the International Integrated Reporting Council in 2021. And last year in 2022, we merged or consolidated again with the IFRS Foundation. We also consolidated the CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. And we really built in the recommendations of the TCFD. So you can see we're, again, simplifying the alphabet soup all down into the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. So let me tell you about these two standards, S1 and S2. First of all, S1, the General Requirement Standard. This is like an umbrella standard, an overarching standard setting out the key concepts, setting out the foundations for reporting, and really requiring a company to disclose material information about its sustainability-related risks and opportunities. By material, we mean what's important to investors, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. What's really groundbreaking about S1 is that we took the TCFD architecture and applied it beyond climate, right across all ESG issues. And that TCFD architecture is governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. This is a very good way to examine how a company approaches sustainability and for an investor to assess its progress and its performance. We do require industry-specific disclosures because sustainability is not one size fits all. And what is material to an oil company is very different from a software company, for example. And investors look at those companies differently and need different data. What's important to remember is that for many companies, this fits really well with your current financial reporting, especially for countries like Turkey that use the IFRS accounting standards. But in fact, they can be used, the ISSB sustainability standards can be used with any accounting system, for example, in the US. So a word on materiality. What do we mean by material? First of all, we're talking about material information, and we mean material information for investors. In fact, we use the same definition of materiality as from the IFRS accounting standards. So the same materiality assessment used for the financial statements is what we apply now to sustainability matters. And that is information is material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence investor decisions. So it's really focused on the decision needs of investors. But having said that, I want to make sure that it's well understood that even though we're talking about what's material to investors, that really does include a company's external impacts on society and the environment. So a company's ability to create and preserve and grow value for its shareholders is linked, absolutely linked to the stakeholders with whom the company works and serves, its employees, its local communities. It's linked to the society and social issues, and it's linked to the company's impact on natural resources. So the relationships and dependencies. And for those companies that are familiar with the integrated reporting framework, and the integrated reporting framework is very strongly understood and accepted in Turkey. These concepts of linked value should be quite familiar. We say, as I mentioned, the standard requires industry-specific disclosure. And the standard requires a company to identify the risks and opportunities that are relevant and to report the information on them. So how do you identify those topics? How do you do that materiality assessment to begin with? And what we say is that a company must consider the ISSB standards, may also consider other standards and practice that is focused on investors. And the same goes for which information or metrics to use. Consider the ISSB standards as the starting point, and then also consider other possibilities. So this is where even though S1 doesn't specify exactly what information or what topics to do, because it, again, sustainability is different from one company to the next and from one industry to the next, we do provide these resources and guidance to identify the topics and to identify the metrics. Now S2, this is our climate standard. It's very important, again, I'll repeat it, this incorporates the TCFD recommendations. So companies that have already been doing TCFD reporting around climate risk are extremely well prepared for S2. The other thing to note about S2 is that it really needs to be used with IFRS S1. That is, S1 provides some of the basic concepts that are needed to report on any topic, including climate. So in view of how much it's built on the TCFD recommendations, it includes requirements around physical risks and transition risks, as well as opportunities for companies. And it includes requirements for cross-industry metrics, such as greenhouse gas emissions, as well as that requirement for industry-specific disclosures. And that's really built, or that's based on accompanying guidance that's very much built, again, on the ISSB standards. Now, I think it's important to emphasize how much the standards evolve with market input. The exposure drafts were put out last year for 4 months of consultation. We had over 1,400 responses from the market, hundreds of meetings. And for those of you who have been following the evolution of the standards, a few of the key things to note that the ISSB evolved and changed along the way include a lot of the considerations around interoperability, as I already mentioned, but also what we call scaling and phasing, or proportionality and release, allowing for the application of the standards by companies of any size or stage of development and in any market or in any industry. They have to, again, be practical and efficient. So we have these scaling and phasing mechanisms built in. We also, although the initial exposure drafts had the climate topics and metrics from the ISSB standards as mandatory, we pulled back and made them guidance instead, at least for a few years. There is a document that was published with the standards called a feedback statement, which gave a very good view on what the difference is between the initial exposure drafts and the final standards. So looking again at some of the ways we support this practical application by companies, making them efficient, include using terminology and concepts already widely understood and used by companies in the market, and then those proportionality and reliefs mechanisms. So including the proportionality, we borrowed concepts from the IFRS accounting standards, including the use of reasonable and supportable information available without undue cost or effort, and also considering a company's skills, capabilities, and resources. What this means is that a company new to sustainability reporting or a small company without large staff and resources can get started on some of the areas of the ISSB standards with more qualitative information to begin with, and then move to quantitative or getting the numbers later. That includes in areas such as, for example, scenario analysis or current and anticipated financial effects. In terms of reliefs, that means temporary reliefs to help companies phase in and help jurisdictions phase in as well. And that includes, for example, in year 1 of reporting with the ISSB standards, you can only do climate and then start to go beyond climate to, for example, human capital or other social issues in year 2. Although another relief is that in year 1, you may report with the half year instead of with the full year financial results earlier. So this is, although we're aiming very much towards having simultaneous sustainability reporting in the same package of information as the financial results, in the first year, you can do it with the half year. Also in year 1, even if scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are material, you can omit them in year 1. So examples of the type of reliefs, the phasing that we're doing, that will also help in addition with the proportionality mechanisms, what we call scaling. So looking ahead to what the ISSB is focused on, that includes a real focus on making sure that we're examining the connection between sustainability reporting and the financial statements, including through the integrated reporting framework. We're focused on that interoperability with different jurisdictions. We're really looking a lot at education and training, what we call capacity building, to help implement the standards amongst preparers, amongst investors or users, and amongst countries, jurisdictions around the world. And we have released a digital taxonomy that is XBRL tagging, and we've just recently completed an agenda consultation on the next 2 years' work. So just to finish up and conclude, I think as you can see, the ISSB is not working in isolation, but rather we are connected with markets, with companies, with investors, and with other standard setters and regulators really worldwide. This is a team effort. The ISSB is responsible for the standards. IOSCO, the securities regulators, have endorsed the standards for their jurisdictions and are helping them with that adoption process. The audit standards, the ISSB, has proposed an audit standard to help with assurance. We see many jurisdictions moving rapidly towards adopting the ISSB standards for their companies, including the UK. We've seen proposals in Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia. We see Japan, Brazil, Canada moving, and we see Turkey moving towards the ISSB standards. But in addition to that jurisdictional adoption, we also expect to see widespread voluntary adoption by companies in response to investors' needs. Investors want this information. They have been using SASB and TCFD, and now ISSB is evolving those standards, and that's what investors need for decision useful information. So that concludes my prepared remarks, and be pleased to take any questions and continue the discussion. There's a lot of resources on our website. As Céline mentioned, she will be able to send out a PDF of this slide deck, and so there's a lot of links to various resources to keep learning more about the ISSB standards and help towards implementation.
So I guess we can start taking questions from our corporates, because we want this to be more of a dialogue between IFRS and the corporates, and to make what challenges are faced by the corporates regarding these. It might be a good ground to make these heard. Müge?
Hi. Hi, Neil. Good to hear from you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the presentation. I'm sorry with my voice, as I'm down with the flu. So if I keep breaking up, apologies now. My question to you, I believe that we're going to pick up the standards here in Turkey for 2025 reporting season, which basically means that we'll have to compare 23 and 24 numbers. So by then, if we don't have TCFD done, but have regular, sustainability reporting, my question actually goes into the auditing side. Will this be a part of the financial auditing, or will this be a part of the sustainability auditing that we do on our reports? Would you happen to know?
So first of all, a little bit of background about the ISSB and assurance. And that is that for the ISSB standards, we do not require assurance. So as a standard setter, it's not our responsibility to demand or require assurance on the standards or on reporting. And what our responsibility is to make sure that the disclosure coming out of our standards is assurable. That is, it's verifiable, it's ready for to be audited. And in fact, in some ways, you know, the creation of the S2 was to look at TCFD and say, okay, what do we need to do to TCFD to make it assurable? What are the characteristics, the details we need to add to make sure that this is consistent, comparable, you know, accuracy, completeness, all the basic requirements for assurance. In terms of actual requirements for assurance, those will come from the jurisdictions as they adopt. So I would expect, and I don't know if Turkey has made clear what its requirements will be, or if there will be requirements. What we see in as proposals come out, for example, in Europe, they require initially limited assurance moving to reasonable. Similarly, the SEC proposal for climate required limited assurance moving to reasonable. And so I would expect to see that in many jurisdictions. And then whether that would come from your financial statement auditor or from a different auditor, I think that might also be stipulated by the jurisdiction. I know that in some jurisdictions, there's debate about whether it must be by a different auditor, or maybe it must be by the same auditor, right? There's different views. But what we also see is that in the US and Europe, the proposals permitting the sustainability assurance to be done by a non-audit firm. That is, by a firm that's not a CPA, you know, not accountants, but what we see, for example, now is that a lot of ESG or sustainability auditing and assurance is done by engineering firms or other types of consultancies, and frequently at a much lower cost, right, than for a professional CPA audit firm. And so, and in fact, with the ISSB developing a new audit standard, they're also making sure that it can be used by non-audit firms or non-accounting firms, right? So it's and in that way, I think it probably could be expected that you wouldn't be expected to use your financial statement auditor also for the sustainability reporting. Does that make sense, Muke? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Makes sense. No, great. Thanks for sharing, Neil. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Muge, for your contribution. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I might have one, if you would just let me. Neil, do you have any advices for corporates who are in the transition period? Like what are the best practices that you're witnessing, and are there any examples that you would like to share with our Turkish corporates over here? We have a very large variety of audience. Like we have people from investor relations, we have from budget and reporting, and we also have people from sustainability. So here it looks like we are still on that transition phase of taking this holistic approach for this. Like, who will be involved in this period, or who will be the real responsible party? So maybe we can get some view from your experience and witnessings.
Sure. So, you know, I think the first step here is to recognize that this is not just a new standard or framework. This is a new way of reporting. I think a lot of issuers have come to think about sustainability reporting as, oh, well, what are we going to add this year? You know, SDGs, Global Compact, GRI, TCFD, SASB, you know, and each year you add a few pages to your sustainability report, you add a new page to your website, you keep building and building. This is a new model of reporting, sustainability reporting, coming out at the same time, in the same place with the financial statements, and with the same rigor, right? With the same level of quality. And so that means a new way of reporting within your companies. So I would suggest that the first step is to take sustainability reporting from maybe where it has lived formerly with corporate affairs or communications, and now bring it under the same roof as financial reporting. That means the same types of similar or the same governance, internal controls, review and sign off, audit trails, and audit readiness, right? And so you're the same people in your financial reporting teams that are responsible for those functions may now also get responsibility for sustainability reporting. So what we see frequently now is we see a new job function of ESG controller, right? So financial controller, now ESG controller. And these individuals are formally are often coming from the finance team. They're coming from the finance team. They know all about that controls and that process for this investor grade data. And now they're applying that to sustainability information. I think and then so you get the processes in place, and now you need the data, right? And now you need the data. And you know, I think that there's certain basic data that all companies now are having to be able to begin dealing with, your emissions, as well as human capital management. It may depend from one industry or one business to the next, but if you don't already have good data, now's the time to start gathering it. And that means from your different operations and from people who may not be used to providing this quality of data. And it also, of course, means looking up and down your value chain to both your suppliers and as well as your customers. The SASB standards, of course, are a huge help for any company of any size in starting to think, well, what do we need to be reporting on? What are the relevant sustainability related risks and opportunities for our company? So whether you operate in a single industry or multiple industries, the SASB standards are a very, very good starting point to say, well, here's the topics. And what's really useful, especially for companies just starting out, is that the SASB standards are very focused. In some markets, some markets are looking at this requirement for industry-specific reporting as though it's an extra burden, it's an added complication. In fact, it's the opposite, because what it means is that a company can focus just on that small set of topics and metrics that are truly relevant. So in the SASB standards, of the 77 industry standards, the average is 6 topics and 13 metrics for each industry. Some are much less. If it's an industry like professional services or something, it's only a handful of topics. Others like oil and gas or financial services might be 10, 11, or 12 topics, but still it's a manageable set to begin reporting on. So I think those are some pieces of advice. And just going back to the first part in terms of controls and processes, I would recommend a resource, and that is there is a in the US especially, and I think it's also used in other markets around the world. I don't know about Turkey, but there's what we call internal controls over financial reporting, ICFR. This is done under the COSO framework, COSO framework for ICFR. COSO this year released new guidance for what they call internal control over sustainability reporting, ICSR. And this is a very, very useful tool to and resource to begin thinking about the those controls and processes around sustainability reporting.
Great. I think that was quite helpful, but it will take some time. It will definitely take some time to
Yeah, and you know,
define the.
Celine, on that, if I could make just a point on that, and you, I'm sure you've heard this before. Everybody says it's a journey, right? It's a journey. Yeah. The best time to start is today. But I think we always have to emphasize this, especially from the investor's point of view. Investors do not want you to wait until everything's perfect. They want to see that you're on the path, right? And so even if you say, we don't have the data yet, but we're working on it. We don't, we're working to identify the topics. We're working to identify the risks and opportunities. As long as you're working, then your investors will be very pleased.
Yeah, one is always greater than zero.
Exactly.
That's the logic. Okay. We have a question from Sinem Özonur. I will just read it for you. Could you please share with us the evolution on investor demands regarding the transition of implementation, as there are multi-standards and multi-reporting requirements?
Great. Well, nice to hear from Sinem, an old contact. Thank you for participating. So in thinking about Sinem, I don't know if so you're asking about the sort of evolution of investor demands. What do investors expect from standards and frameworks? Is that right?
Hi, Neil. Actually, I was thinking how they are evolving, actually, as there are, they were expecting multi-standards, multi-reporting, and if it is going to consolidate, hope it will consolidate under IFRS, then are they willing to, what the expectations are? Are they willing to no more ask for any reporting that is like GRI, TCFD, or SASB, and they will just look at IFRS. And actually, then there is a question of mapping. I think that would have been my follow-up question. If you do have any plans for any cross-mapping and explaining as like footnotes, but if like the investor side really is willing to evolve with the implementation and the transition is what I would like to ask.
Yeah, it's a great question, and let's be realistic here. There's, it's only worth doing if your users, your investors want it and will use it, right? The standards have been created, as I said, in response to market demand, and that includes the world's investors. Throughout the consultations that the IFRS Foundation did and that the ISSB has done, the investor voice has been very strong. In fact, investors have been represented in the feedback to the ISSB in a greater proportion than in probably any other IFRS consultation in the past. A tremendous number of investors have participated. The other way that the investor voice is represented is through what we call our investor advisory group. So this is a group that was a SASB group of investors, and that has continued and now become the ISSB Investor Advisory Group. And that group includes the world's biggest, most significant investors, the index funds, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. It includes the big active, Fidelity, Capital, includes sovereign wealth funds like Norges Bank and Temasek. So it accounts now, I think, for around $50 trillion in assets under management and over 60 members. Those investors and many others have for years now been asking for TCFD and SASB, right? Because TCFD and SASB were focused on the financial prospects of their investments. What we've done now is taken TCFD and SASB and made them into an accounting standard, made them into a standard that's ready for mandatory reporting, that's ready for assurance, that's ready for global implementation, allowing for global comparability. So, even going back more than a decade, investors were asking, please, we need narrative information around your governance, your strategy, your risk management, and we need your metrics and targets. And we want it industry specific. And that's what we've achieved, right? So that's exactly what investors have been asking for. The GRI standards are still very important, but remember that they are not necessarily focused on investors. Investors are amongst the stakeholders the GRI standards serve, but the GRI standards are really much more about sustainable development, achieving the sustainable development goals for economies, around a company's work on sustainable development that's beyond its core business, beyond its business performance and prospects. So and we may, I don't know, I can't say that we'll be doing mapping exactly, but we are working closely with the GRI to make sure that it's clear what are where there's an overlap and where there are common metrics and definitions and so on, so you can reduce the duplication. If you're doing both GRI and you're for multi-stakeholders and you're doing ISSB for investors, it'll be clear where there's overlap and you can reduce duplication. Similarly, with Europe and the CSRD, we're working on releasing, I wouldn't call it mapping, but we're releasing what we call an interoperability tool. And that will show very clearly what is the overlap? What is the overlap that is focused on investors and where we can achieve agreement? And then outside of that, what are the requirements that are unique to the ISSB? And on the other side, what is unique to European standards? So this will start to make it very clear what reporting you need to do to satisfy the ISSB and Europe, and then what is extra on either side. One of the key things that has been a huge help in this is that just over the summer, Europe changed its definition of the financial materiality side. So with the European directive, there's what we call double materiality. There's financial materiality and impact materiality. And it was kind of initially mixed together. But what Europe now has done is really clarified and in fact switched to a definition of financial materiality that is the same as the IFRS. So is the same as ours. That is focused on the needs of primary users or investors. So, and this makes it much, much easier to identify what is that area of overlap, because that's the area of financial materiality for Europe. So then beyond that, for Europe, for the European standards, companies will need to do an additional impact materiality assessment. That is, what are the impacts on society and environment that have nothing to do with your business performance? And that's really where the GRI standards can also be a really significant help, because the GRI standards are very much focused on that impact materiality pillar, as the GRI calls it. I hope that helps, Sinem.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Neil, can you also please tell us if ISSB is planning any kind of differentiation between this transition phase for developed countries and for emerging countries? Is there any plan?
We have so a couple of comments on that. First of all, we're not making this like a 2 levels or anything. Like it's not like 2 speeds. But as I said, we have tried to make sure that we have the proportionality and we have the reliefs to make this practical and achievable. When IOSCO made its announcement in July, we also issued an overview of what we call an adoption guide. And that adoption guide will be coming out in the next couple of months. It's an adoption guide for jurisdictions, for countries in adopting the ISSB standards. And it will include guidance around what type of further reliefs or extensions they might offer. So if a country, for example, emerging market country, is really just not, not ready for 2025 or 2026, but needs more time in terms of going beyond climate, or more time for scope 3, or more time getting into simultaneous reporting. The adoption guide will help jurisdictions make those decisions and provide those reliefs. So what we need, we need a global base. If it's going to be a global baseline, it's got to be consistent. There will be countries moving at different speeds, but we all need to end up at the same place. And that same place, again, won't be like 2 tiers or 2 levels for developed and emerging. We're all getting to the same place with different reliefs and along the way. So I hope that makes sense. We've built in certain reliefs, but jurisdictions may also extend them or build their own reliefs, and that adoption guide will help them assess and make those decisions.
Okay, well understood. Thank you. Do we have any other question from the corporates? Zeynep Hanım?
It is Zainab from TSKB. I have a quick question. I was wondering about the timing and the place actually where the ISSB standards will be present. Because it occurs to me when we present our final annual results in 3 months after the end of the year. But when it comes to ISSB standards, how are we going to present and when are we going to present our ISSB standard results? Is it going to be a part of our annual report, or is it going to be part of our integrated report? Is it certain, or is it still an ongoing process?
This is another area where the ISSB, like assurance, has been careful not to say exactly what to do. And the reason is that different jurisdictions may have different requirements. They may already have requirements in place, or they may introduce requirements in the future around exactly where to report, right? So in some jurisdictions, it might be with the MD&A, management's discussion and analysis, or say in the UK in the strategic report. But it's what we say is that it needs to be in the same general package of financial reporting, right? So the same at the basically same time, and perhaps in the annual report. That's right. Where in terms of timing, as I mentioned before, we're trying to get to the point where it is at the same time and in the same place. But for the first year, there's a relief of being able to do it with the half-year results. So if you do, your annual report 3 months after year end, you could actually, in the first year, wait until you report half-year financial results to issue an ISSB report, but then try to get on the same timing in year 2. So I hope that helps. It certainly we're going to see, I think, slightly different practices and places for this reporting. It may also determine what degree or what type of assurance you need to do. Certainly here in the UK, if reporting goes in the 10K, as the SEC is proposing for climate, that requires a really high level of governance and control and assurance. So that, and I think that we'll see that evolve in different jurisdictions.
Thank you, Neil, because we were really wondering about how it's going to be a solo report, or it's going to be a part of a consolidated report. But you mean it's going to be part of actually a real reporting part, like IFRS reporting or integrated reporting. It's not going to be another piece of reporting, I guess. Thank you.
I think that's definitely the intention. The intention also is to bring it closer. Bring it closer to financial reporting. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks like we are using the time quite efficiently. We have one more question from Sinem Hanım. I will read it again for you. Could you please elaborate on your collaborations with supervision, monitoring, regulatory bodies, and auditing and assurance on IFRS S1 and S2? Is it clear?
Sure, yeah. So, and this happens in a number of different ways. So collaborations, when we think about collaborations, remember how the IFRS Foundation's history of this, right? Like the IFRS Foundation is working with standard setters and regulatory bodies in 144 jurisdictions around the world. So we have 144 relationships with regulators and standard setters already. And we're working with them one-on-one now with the ISSB, but also collectively in different ways. This happens through IOSCO. So IOSCO is doing, we've organized training events for regulators in Egypt and in Singapore, for example. And IOSCO is very focused on helping their members with this. It happens through the jurisdictional working group I mentioned, also with our sustainability standards advisory forum, and that's a larger group of standard setters and regulators that are working with us on developing the standards. So, one of the important things to remember here is that this is not a case where we've created the standards and now we're pushing them out to different countries. They've been working with us all along. Right? So we've made sure that we had the input and the cooperation and the dialogue with the regulators and the standard setters and the monitoring authorities in different countries throughout the creation of the standards. Again, that's happened individually, it's happened through groups, and it's happened through IOSCO. In terms of assurance and audit and assurance, the same goes for the audit and assurance oversight bodies or regulators, but also for the standard setters like the ISSB. We're making sure that we're working closely with them as they create an audit standard. So there's extensive collaboration with regulators, and that has gone from the creation of the standards, and it'll carry through the adoption and implementation of the standards.
I think that was quite helpful too. Regarding the time, it's already 4 o'clock. Neil, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very helpful, and thank you for all the contribution from our audience with the questions and your answers. I hope we have all utilized all the information from this webinar, and thank you so much, all of you, for joining us.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.